Hello, Prime Minister Trudeau. As you know, to further the project of reconciliation between Indigenous peoples in Canada and to honor the commitment made by the Crown to strengthen the nation to nation relationships, a new royal proclamation has been formed, and it is to my pleasure to present to you the new wampum belt for the Royal Proclamation 2022. But before we begin and go into the details of the wampum belt that we have created, we feel it is so important to give you the context behind the symbols on the belt. As we have come to realize and acknowledge over the many years, reconciliation is more than a performative apology and must involve directly acknowledging and acting to correct past wrongs. The goal is to work towards a peaceful relationship, allowing Indigenous nations and settlers to coexist in harmony. We feel that it is imperative that before any new promises that Canada makes, before making any of those new promises, Canada must apologize for the establishment of the Indigenous residential school system, their negative impact on land claims, and must apologize for water relations and the failure of the 2016 Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The new proclamation needs to address reconciling the relationship between Indigenous nations and the Canadian government, and it must address inconsistencies of the 2016 TRC's call to action and issues that impacted Indigenous family structures, land claims, and access to safe water to promote Indigenous rights and traditions. The proposed wampum belt will identify these issues through traditional Indigenous symbology, which I will explain in greater detail. We wanted to create a belt that acknowledges our awareness of the problems and our commitment to solving them. The first element of the proposed wampum belt is two parallel lines running the length of the belt. As illustrated in the two-row wampum treaty belt, two parallel lines represents the path of European customs and laws, as well as Indigenous customs and laws, and that they shall remain separate but never outspace each other. Secondly, there are two squares on opposite ends of the belt. Similar to the Five Nations territorial belt, the two squares represents two distinctive nations, separate but equal. The designs on the proposed belt indicate the importance of promoting distinctive Indigenous and Western nations in the pursuit of reconciliation to ensure that Indigenous peoples remain connected to their family and traditions. The belt also includes two eyes to promote the two-eyed approach in learning. One eye represents learning through the Indigenous ways of knowing, and the other eye represents the Western ways of knowing. This further promotes the idea that while the two cultures are distinct, both must be utilized in order to achieve reconciliation, because connection to culture and tradition is central to Indigenous nationhood. The water droplets being viewed by the eyes promote the responsibility and accountability Indigenous peoples have to water. The Royal Proclamation 2022 proposes allowing Indigenous nations their own jurisdiction over water within their communities to ensure that this connection to the resource remains intact. The central focus of the belt shows two people beneath a roof joined together by a tree. The everlasting tree depicts the tree of peace, a traditional Indigenous idea representing the great law of peace. The Great Law serves as a metaphor for confederacy and shelters the families of the nations while connecting all people through its far-reaching roots. The tree has been included to show commitment to a harmonious relationship between Indigenous nations and the Canadian government. The roof symbol illustrates a traditional longhouse. In Indigenous tradition, the peacemaker used the longhouse to connect the East to the West, making the Great Law. This indicates the government's commitment to address the issues of each Indigenous nation across the entire country. The longhouse also emphasizes a need to care for family and friends. Finally, there is a white horizontal line connecting every symbol on the belt. This is a motif used on many wampum belts to indicate a path or road. The line symbolizes the path to reconciliation and the necessity of addressing each issue that I have mentioned already. The Royal Proclamation 2022 Wampum Belt is a step towards reconciliation and is a binding promise that must be held by the Canadian government. This belt serves as a tangible representation of the agreement to promote Indigenous rights and traditions. Educating the public is a vital first step in achieving reconciliation. Including traditional Indigenous stories in the Canadian education system would bring awareness to the issues facing Indigenous nations, as well as promote a decolonized space within history. The narrative must shift to promote trust between the Indigenous nations and the Western government by prioritizing the issues faced by those Indigenous nations, such as family dynamics, land claims, and access to safe water. This ensures that the Canadian government is held accountable for the detrimental effects of colonization. There has been so much hardship, so much turmoil that has gone through and that has happened because of a lack of ownership by the Canadian government, owning their fault, owning the responsibility that they had when creating treaties and past agreements with Indigenous nations. And now is the time to act. Now is the time to not only make this new proclamation, but to stand by the words written in that document, to stand by the symbols symbolized on this wampum belt, and to make sure that change is no longer an idea, but a reality. And we believe that the wampum belt that we have created is an amazing depiction of the Canadian government owning that responsibility and deciding that now is the time to change. Thank you so much, Justin Trudeau, for your time. We are so excited for the future and for all the things that are to come when discussing and when enacting and improving on the nation-to-nation relationships between the Indigenous communities and Indigenous nations and the Canadian government. Thank you so much, Prime Minister. It's been a pleasure.